We've been proactive to make sure that we have the right people voting, electing the right leaders to lead this country.
Then Noem responded to criticism yesterday on the site formerly known as Twitter, saying this: yes, we must build election infrastructure that makes it easy and secure for eligible American citizens to vote while preventing non-citizens, including what she calls illegal aliens, from casting ballots. The choice of who to vote for is obviously up to the voters themselves. Clean up on aisle 9, Angelo. Here's the thing. Who are the right people? These are the questions. Who are the right people? For whom do we want them voting for? And furthermore, where is the evidence of the widespread voter fraud? Even the Heritage Foundation has not determined there is widespread voter fraud. Their own data and research says there's not. So is this a case of if they just say it enough, people start to believe it?
Yeah, so I think that's part of it, in terms of their execution. But there's something to also consider is that where's the evidence where you can actually find them? There are people. Now, that's not evidence, but the source of it is there's this constellation of right-wing influencers that have been pickled in these lies now for 6 years. And they're not just out there, talking about it. They're working directly with the Trump administration to say, now it's time, now that you're in power, go back and find proof of the things and the conspiracies that we were pushing 5 or 6 years ago. So if you look at what happened in Fulton County, just a week before the raid in Fulton County, Patrick Byrne, who was in the Oval Office in 2020 with Sidney Powell and Michael Flynn saying when Trump said to seize the voting machines, he had to leave a TV hit before it happened to do an emergency meeting at the White House, which apparently was about some upcoming thing related to election conspiracy. So to me, where's the source? It's all of these influencers out there that they are now basically running the playbook around whatever false claim they have been holding on to for 6 or 7 years. And they're everywhere. There's a bunch of people percolating in Maricopa County now in Arizona. And so that's the thing that's sort of giving it some fuel. Obviously, Trump's own narrative and all the externalities for it. But you can really zero in, and that's what you'll find.
It's just amazing to me. I mean, imagine you are an undocumented person in this country. You are right now afraid to go to work, afraid to go to the grocery store, and they think you're showing up on election day.
Okay, clock it.
I mean, it doesn't even make sense. And then to layer onto that, you have the president posting this on X on Friday. I have searched the depths of legal arguments not yet articulated or vetted on this subject and will be presenting an irrefutable one in the very near future. There will be voter ID for the midterm elections, whether approved by Congress or not. So sort of like a passing glance. I'm sorry, that was on Truth, not on X. You get the idea. It's a passing glance to the Save America Act, right? The fact that right now there is action in Congress to have mandatory IDs for when people register to vote, for when people go to vote. He can't do what he's saying he will do by presidential fiat. But I think part of the play here is to just continue to make people uncertain about American elections. And I think he is banking on the idea that simply sowing those seeds of doubt ultimately will benefit him.
I believe so. I think they're trying to cast doubt for the 2026 midterm elections because they know the results are not going to be in their favor. Historically, midterm elections are never good for the sitting president. But I think that if I am reading the tea leaves, it's going to be a massive blue wave. I think that people are upset that Trump has not gotten through or not followed through on any of his campaign promises, whether it be to bring down prices. They're looking at things like the ICE murdering American citizens in the streets. And they're like, this is not what I signed up for. ICE has gone too far. And so he's already trying to cast out. We saw him do it in 2020 in the lead up to the election with Joe Biden and him going after mail-in voting and all of these things. And I think, too, now they've seemed to tailor the message to include illegal immigrants. And they're saying that illegals are voting. And, of course, we all want citizens to be the only ones voting in our elections. But that is what is happening. Right. They're acting like this is some widespread issue. In Utah, they did an audit of their registered voters of over 2 million voters, and they found one illegal immigrant registered, and the person had never even voted. So this is not some widespread issue like they're trying to make it out to be, but they're trying to use that to justify their what I would call voter suppression. And that's where you have Kristi Noem saying that we only want the right people showing up and voting for the right leaders. And it just feeds into into this pattern of everything that they're already doing to try to control the upcoming election, whether it be Trump calling for nationalizing elections, seizing the ballots in Georgia, wanting to end mail-in voting. And I think that it follows a pattern that they are definitely looking at future elections, whether it's 2026 or 2028, and trying to manipulate the outcome.
They're trying to get voters to believe two things that are in direct conflict, which is that Democrats are inept at government. They don't know what they're doing. But at the same time, these same Democrats have spent years behind the scenes getting all these undocumented people to vote illegally, getting dead people to vote illegally, and that they've been able to do that while being inept at government. And that is at the root of conspiracies, right? And a lot of that lives online. The other thing that I think is really interesting about this, Angelo, is the timing of all of this. When you watch Kristi Noem get all of a sudden start talking about voting, why? Because she's under siege, right? Donald Trump has issues with her. I know that. I've heard from people on the inside, and so have a lot of other reporters. But Tulsi Gabbard herself, and this is from New York Times from February 9th, her 2020 election claims put her back in favor with Trump. With the renewed investigation into baseless claims about fraud during the 2020 election, she is back in the spotlight in Mr. Trump's good graces. Miss Gabbard's superpower, at least in the eyes of Mr. Trump, is her enthusiasm for what many consider conspiracy theories and her relentless focus on attacking and rooting out the so-called deep state. A lot of the things that we're seeing these members of his cabinet do have nothing to do with what they're actually saying they want done. It is to make him happy.
Yeah, and it's more than just to make him happy, too. It's actually to help him achieve a larger externality. And what you just described is a pattern that we've seen play out over and over again with right-wing media that has now become government policy. And that pattern is this. Trump makes a ridiculous claim. Maybe he plucked it from one of the Truth Social posts. Maybe it just came up with his own imagination. But he makes this argument. And then someone in right-wing media, a prominent influencer, it used to be Sean Hannity back in the day. Now it's a Steve Bannon or Benny Johnson, somebody who's trying to make a name for themselves. They then trip over themselves to backfill it, to make that thing substantiate, whatever it is, regardless of how absurd that argument is. And that is how they curry favor. And that pattern, and of course then Trump awards them, right? He gives them more credit or acknowledge it, maybe more access, maybe a little wink. Here it's the same thing in practice in the administration. He sows his distrust, his anger, his sense of negative sentiment with an administration official, and then they then scurry to try to do something to backfill a claim that he's been making, except instead of it just being with words, they now use government power to then try to find or manipulate or engineer concrete evidence of it, even if it's not there, so that he can either reinforce or sustain or fuel a larger narrative and then, as has been discussed here, take some larger external action. At the end of the day, he's already said what he wants to do. He doesn't want people voting. He wants to make it hard for them to vote. He wants to cheat and steal. And he thinks the ends justify the means here, and he's going to do it. One way or another, at least he's going to try to. And all of these things are the pieces to help him execute that.
I'm just reminded of Mark Elias, who has sat at this table many a times and has said that the president they were successful in Fulton County. They got a judge to sign a warrant to seize ballots. And so if they will do that for an election that happened in 2020, in the year of our Lord 2026, what do we think they are going to be able to do this November?
Barack Obama, he's been in the news for a couple reasons. One, he sat down for a lengthy interview with a hit liberal podcaster, Brian Tyler Cohen. You may have seen his face or have heard of him. This is what we're seeing different politicians do more and more of. Obviously, anyone on any channel would kill for an Obama interview right now. Well, Cohen got it. And this is a rarity because the former president doesn't do a lot of long interviews these days, doesn't get pulled into every Trump debate. And so he was asked about and made his first public comments about Donald Trump's viciously racist online post about the Obamas, which was later taken down. Here was the response.
As I'm traveling around the country, as you're traveling around the country, you meet people. They still believe in decency, courtesy, kindness. And there's this sort of clown show that's happening in social media and on television. And what is true is that there doesn't seem to be any shame about this among people who used to feel like you had to have some sort of decorum and a sense of propriety and respect for the office, right? So that's been lost. but the reason I point out that I don't think the majority of the American people approve of this is because ultimately the answer is going to come from the American people.
When he first came into office, Obama was one of the younger modern presidents, on par with Clinton or Kennedy rather than Trump or Biden. And he discussed how elder Democrats need to be open to the younger generation.
I'm pretty healthy, 64, feel great.
Yeah.
But the truth is, half of the references that my daughters make about social media, TikTok, etc., I don't know who they're talking about.
Yeah.
There is a element of, at some point, you age out. You're not connected directly to the immediate struggles that folks are going through. I'm not making a hard and fast rule here, but I do think that Democrats do well when we have candidates who are plugged into the moment, to the zeitgeist, to the times, and the particular struggles that folks are thinking about as they look towards the future rather than look backward toward the past. That spirit, that energy, it's out there, and you can feel it, but it's bottled up. We haven't given enough outlets for young people to figure out, how do I become a part of that? And that's this enormous untapped power that we have to get back to.
Ever respectful, Obama saying the party's got to look to the younger candidates who are plugged in.
The current White House, this administration, and their enablers, they're behaving so badly, they're doing such crazy stuff, that it shouldn't be hard for our side to coalesce around the areas where we agree on and focus on that. And I think that that is going to happen if we are effective in winning the midterms.
What did you see him emphasizing there?
Look, I think he's saying what a lot of people already recognize, which is, in terms of the midterms, that's going to be largely a referendum off of Trump. But we have a long path forward. Democrats do have a poor approval rating. We have brand problems that need to be fixed. Those aren't just going to fix themselves in a vacuum. I hope that people don't see success in the midterms as some indication that we've solved everything, because we haven't. But he talked about that a little bit, and I'm not sure if you're going to show a subsequent clip where he does discuss a little bit of the infighting, but I think that's going to be it. He has a very particular focus on coalition building as opposed to purity politics, and I think in an era where everybody has a voice, everybody has a platform online, making sure that we can still remember that the goal of politics is actually to build a coalition, to cobble together a big enough coalition to win, to be able to do something, is first and foremost.
Well, let's turn to that, because he discussed it with you at length. He referenced things that people are familiar with, the kind of mood of certain people being a scold, trying to dictate to others what their political morality should be, or this term virtue signaling. And this, I thought, was an interesting exchange. So we cut it at some length. Let's take a look.
I think there was a certain way of talking about issues for Democrats where we sounded like scolds. There was a virtue signaling that made it seem as if ordinary folks, if they did not say things in exactly the right way or meet this litmus test, that they were being chastised, pushed away. And the truth is, most of us, all of us, are complicated, and we have blind spots, and sometimes we say dumb stuff, and if you want to create an environment that is welcoming and makes people feel, okay, there's room for me here, then the message and the story we tell has to be, all right, none of us are perfect, all of us count. We all have good in us that we can tap into. We can all learn from each other. And And I think that is something we need to recover.
What did you see him hitting there?
I mean, similar to what I was saying before, I think that, at its core, again, politics is about getting enough votes to actually win. And this stuff really does, it's personal for a lot of people. They hold it really, they wear it on their shirt sleeve. And so it's not a surprise that when it comes to these political matters that people will take it personally and they will want to impose litmus tests and they'll, do what they do online these days. But I think it's important to get these reminders from somebody who, doesn't have any skin in the game, but he has a lot of cachet. And so he has the freedom to be able to come out and say this kind of stuff to reroute the party, I think, into a smarter direction as we head toward 2028, even if it's just planting a little bug in our heads to say, like, we are, I'm sure you've heard people say politics is a bus. You're not necessarily going right to your front door. You are taking the bus to the closest destination to where you live, and that's how we have to think of it. We can't let perfect be the enemy of good, and you're going to have people within the coalition who disagree with each other, but it's going to be important to make sure to remember that it is a coalition at the end of the day.
It's interesting coming from him as well because he's won these campaigns. He doesn't have more to run. So even for people who are skeptical and don't like the message, it's different than some other old school Democrat saying, hey, I don't like this. He's speaking about it from the kind of good faith position within his party of how to win. You guys also touched on the Mamdani energy. Take a look.
What happened in our campaign and what you recently saw in Mamdani's campaign in New York.
Yeah.
When there's that sense of joy and engagement and involvement, then people feel like, all right, this is not just some transactional grind. This is me becoming part of a community.
Isn't it funny? Because I don't know about you, but like we use this word culture in different ways, but there is a culture of politics, and the idea that what was once the liberal street protests, counterculture energy, say, of the 70s, lost sight of that. How did liberals, even sometimes young liberals, get perhaps unfairly caricatured as no fun or hall monitors, and then Mamdani came along and reminded everyone, or you could be like this.
And look, between Mamdani now in 2026 and Obama in 2008, those are parallel campaigns. Those are people whose campaigns actually did inspire hope, as opposed to feeling like, as opposed to feeling like it's the lesser of two evils or whatever it may be. But politics needs to be hopeful. I mean, you are building a culture. I mean, to your exact point, you're building a culture and a community, and people don't want to join a community that is overwhelmingly negative, especially on this side. And so we have like winning formulas right in front of us. Yeah. I don't know how many times we need to be hit over the head with this idea that if you can have a hopeful, inclusive campaign, a la Barack Obama in 2008 or Zohran Mamdani in 2026, that the formula is there. We just need people who are willing to like pick up that mantle and not, fall into the DC trap of protecting institutions and processes and norms that those institutions are not the end. They are a means to an end, but the end has to be people. Yeah. It has to be people focused. And that's what Barack Obama's campaign was, 20 years ago almost. And it's what Zohran Mamdani's campaign was just this past year.
And real quick, here were some of the quick light moments you guys had.
Wasn't political. Bad Bunny's halftime show. It was demonstrating and displaying. This is what a community is.
Are aliens real?
They're real, but I haven't seen them.
Is Tupac alive?
He's alive on my playlist. If you're going to pull off a prank, it's got to be on somebody who can prank you back, and wasn't nobody going to prank me.
Did you find him to be the same old fun Obama, or now he's in his elder statesman role?
No, look, this dude knows how to hang, and I think that is such an understated value. Like, if you can get a guy who can just without cursing, who can just like hang on a podcast, who can go the next day to the NBA All-Star game and throw down about sports, and who can talk politics better than anybody else. I think like that there is so much power in something like that, because look, we're in the TikTok era. There is so much focus on authenticity and relatability, and this dude is the ultimate, he is the ultimate guy, and he can do everything. He doesn't just fit neatly into like one bucket where the only thing you can talk about is politics, and there's a lot of virtue in that, and that's why Barack Obama is Barack Obama, and it's so difficult for other people to replicate that.
Joining us, MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell, MS Now White House reporter Laura Barone-Lopez, MS Now legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher, and senior editor at the Free Press, Joe Nocera. All right, so Michael, we've heard from Massey, we've heard from Khanna, we've heard from Mace, we've heard from some former reps like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Is there a concerted push beyond those people to put more pressure? I'm going to talk about the Republican side, because the Democrats, I imagine I know where they stand, to put pressure on Pam Bondi to release more files?
I mean, look, Katie, it's tough to tell right now because Congress is out of session, so lawmakers have the luxury of only having to respond to news articles or news stories or news of the day if they want to. They're not prompted by reporters in the hallways. But I will note we are hearing a lot of concerns and criticism of that letter that Pam Bondi had sent to Congress. And by the way, that was required by the Epstein Files Transparency Act, that within 15 days of all the files being released, that letter outlining the redactions had to be sent to Congress. And I had spoken to a number of lawmakers over the recent weeks who kept telling me that they were looking forward to reading that letter because there were a lot of concerns about how the DOJ went forward with those redactions, victims' names and personal identification information being out in the public, some high-profile, high-powered individuals, their names being redacted. There was a lot of this concern that were only, by the way, mounting after members of Congress were able to go behind closed doors and view the unredacted material to actually find out what the DOJ had left in and left out. This letter is only accentuating those concerns because their questions about the redactions are not fully answered. Members of Congress are saying they don't have the complete information. And then it's that list, as you mentioned, of around 300 individuals, some of whom say they have no connection to Jeffrey Epstein. A lot of lawmakers accusing the DOJ of trying to muddy the water here. I'll read to you some of what we heard first from Eric Swalwell, the Democrat from California. He wrote on X, he was part of that list in the letter yesterday. He said, LOL, so one loser sends another loser a news article with my name on it, and the cover-up clan at the DOJ wants to put me in the same drawer as Donald Trump. Doesn't work that way. Trump is a friend of the pedos. I'm their worst nightmare. Now, again, Katie, it's important to note it's not just Democrats, it's Republicans as well. I want to read to you part of what Nancy Mace said. She's the Republican congresswoman from South Carolina. She was one of the 4 Republicans, by the way, who signed on to the discharge petition in order to set this entire process in place of releasing the Epstein files. She took concern with some of the arguments and the reasonings for the redactions that were in that letter, saying, quote, citing work product privilege will not save the DOJ from releasing all the Epstein files. She says that she's going to continue to call for the release of all the files. The DOJ has said it's had around 6 million on hand. Only 3.5 million have been released. So, Katie, to sum it all up, a lot of lawmakers were looking to this letter before it was released for it to clear some things up. I think it's only led to more questions.
So, Fallon, how much of the documents have been released? I mean, is it all of them? DOJ says it's all of them, but Channel 4 in the UK is saying it's only 2% according to a metadata analysis that they did. I don't know if they're accurate, but what do we know?
Of course, and we don't have specific reporting on what they're reporting, but I want to be really careful about that UK report because you'll remember that some of the stuff that's privileged from the release are things like child pornography, things that depict death. So those are typically video files, which are large, and I think that's what they're getting at with that 2% possibly. But at this point, the DOJ has released 3.5 million files. They had about 6 overall. They've decided to withhold some. But in this letter, they're really detail light on why they've withheld things. They talk about what the law entails and what they're allowed to withhold and the fact that they redacted things and the legal rationale for that. But they leave out details on specific redactions and why they redacted certain things. This summary is extremely broad. And so we don't fully know what they're still holding on to.
So I looked up Kurt Cobain. I was wondering, why is Kurt Cobain on this list? He's in a PDF of a book that Epstein appeared to have. You have Elvis being mentioned. This is the editor of an online publication called Ultimate Classic Rock, claims Elvis was mentioned in an email, a business pitch that cited a project using Presley's music as a previous success. I mean, they're just randomly in there. They have nothing to do with Epstein.
And that's the thing. This list of the 300 plus names of those government officials and politically facing people has become the buzziest part of this, because really this is where the most meat is. But it's, as Ro Khanna said, muddying the water. So you have all these names of people who are actual government officials who may have been convicted of, or not convicted, but maybe under investigation for potential wrongdoing. But then you have people like Marilyn Monroe and Janis Joplin. And I was curious, so I looked into the files to see what are those people doing there. Marilyn Monroe, Jeffrey Epstein received a press invite to a screening of My Week with Marilyn starring Michelle Williams. That's why Marilyn Monroe is in there. Janis Joplin is in there because of a newsletter. And at the bottom of the newsletter, there is a playlist with like 20 songs from the 60s and 70s, and it has Janis Joplin, Piece of My Heart.
So what's the point of releasing a letter with all these names in it, if it's not to muddy the water, as Ro Khanna said? And I asked you this, Joe, because you're writing today about how just the mere fact that you are mentioned in the Epstein files, or your name appears in it, can lead to some bad days.
More than that. I mean, the example that I used in my article is Casey Wasserman.
Yeah.
Who's about to sell his agency because he's going to lose all his clients because they're leaving, saying, you know, you're a bad guy. You consorted with Giselle Maxwell, you know, who's a criminal and is in prison, and therefore you're associated with Epstein. And now, unlike Janis Joplin, there really are some back and forths between Ghislaine Maxwell.
What's the extent of the back and forth? Explain it.
Well, first of all, he did go on Epstein's jet. But why? Because in 2002, he went on a trip to Africa with the Bill Clinton Foundation, and Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton loves to borrow private jets, as we all know. And that's why that's the only time he was ever on the jet, and that's the only time he ever met Jeffrey Epstein. He had a 2-month flirtation. Whether it went beyond that, nobody knows. But in 2003, in March and April 2003, you see a bunch of very flirty emails between Maxwell and Casey Wasserman. He was 28. He was married. It should be between him and his wife. 23 years ago, nobody knew Ghislaine Maxwell was a criminal. Nobody knew.
This is 2003.
2003.
It's not. It's before Jeffrey Epstein is convicted.
Before there was any.
The flirtation, in retrospect, looks gross.
Yeah.
You can argue it's gross because he was married at the time, but you're not arguing that it's criminal and that the idea that he's somehow complicit in the Epstein.
Correct.
Cover up and Epstein sex crimes is wrong.
And there's a lot of people like that where they're being pilloried when their connection to Epstein or Maxwell is really tangential, and in some cases it's really hard to know what's real and what's not.
So what do you make of that letter from Pam Bondi?
Well, I mean, muddying the waters is kind of the game for them. You know, the more that they can have you looking at Janis Joplin and not looking at Donald Trump.
Or Howard Lutnick.
I mean, Howard Lutnick, who knows how close he was to Epstein, but his big problem really is he lied.
Yeah.
I mean, if he had just said, yeah, once upon a time I went to the island for an hour in the afternoon, if he had said that in the beginning, it'd be a lot different.
Do we know how closely the White House is working with Bondi on this?
How closely, how often they speak? No. But I mean, you know, just adding to the list of the people who work in this White House and have had some kind of association with Epstein is also Tom Barrack, who had more than even potentially Howard Lutnick. That's the president's special envoy to Syria and also his ambassador to Turkey. And he had ongoing communications with Epstein, even beyond Epstein's conviction and after Trump first won in 2016. So there are a lot of people here that the administration is trying not to talk about. I know our own Jake Traylor on Friday tried to ask the president when he was leaving the White House about Howard Lutnick, and the president looked at him and then fully ignored the question and moved on and had the benefit of, you know, Marine One's blades
chopper
going.
Noise,
chopper noise to be able to ignore it. But in terms of how much the president is talking directly to Pam Bondi, I can't say. I mean, we have obviously seen him very publicly say over and over again that he does not want to talk about this anymore, that he wants to move on, that he wants the country to move on. You saw that Pam Bondi went so far as to try to point to the Dow and has become an internet meme over saying the Dow is at 50,000 during the hearing to try to say we should be talking about other things beyond Epstein. But this isn't going away.
The survivors have now offered multiple times to talk to DOJ, and Pam Bondi in the beginning of that hearing last week said that she was open to talking to all of them. Do we know if anybody has yet had an interview or even scheduled an interview or had communication with DOJ about talking potentially to them?
At this point, we don't. She has not talked to survivors. Survivors were extremely upset after last week's hearing about the way that they felt she completely disregarded them, even when they were sitting in that room. So at this point, it does not seem like there's anything on the books.
The core issue is how many other men had sex with underage girls that were handed to them by Jeffrey Epstein. That's what the Justice Department should be investigating. And if they were doing that, so much of this other stuff would go away.
Why aren't they?
That's the question. They're so uninterested. And Todd Blanche basically said we're uninterested when he released the latest tranche of Epstein emails. They don't want to do it. They don't want to go there.
Iran is signaling it's willing to compromise ahead of tomorrow's critical meeting on Tehran's nuclear program in Geneva. Iranian officials are hoping to get some relief from U.S. sanctions stifling its economy, but the White House is not backing down in its pressure campaign, sending the world's largest aircraft carrier to the Middle East, joining what is already a formidable American armada in that region. Joining us now from Geneva is MS Now's Ines de la Cuetara, and also with me, Mark Polymeropoulos, former CIA officer and MS Now national security and intelligence analyst, and MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode. Thank you all for joining me. So, Ines, talk about the agenda for tomorrow's meeting. What's on it?
Hey, Alex. Yeah. So according to Iranian state media, these are going to be indirect talks. So similar to what we saw playing out in Oman a few days ago during the first round of talks, where the U.S. and Iran never actually came face to face. And instead, they held separate meetings with the Omani foreign minister. It was the Omanis mediating. And we understand it's going to be the Omanis mediating this time around as well. The meeting is going to be taking place at the Omani embassy in Geneva. We understand it's going to be the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, leading the U.S. delegation. On the Iranian side, it'll be the Iranian foreign minister. We found out today that the Iranian foreign minister already in Geneva met this morning with the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. That is significant because Iran had pretty much suspended all of its cooperation with the IAEA since the U.S.'s strikes on Iran this summer. And Grossi on Friday at the Munich Security Conference said that inspectors had been allowed into Iran, but they hadn't actually been able to go into any of the sites that were targeted by the U.S. this summer. So there are still lots of questions as to the status of Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium. So we'll see if we get any more clarity on that tomorrow. But I will say there is a sense that this could be the last chance that Iran has to strike a deal, because, of course, this comes as a second aircraft carrier is on its way to the Middle East. And you know, President Trump has made it clear that he is prepared to use force should he need to.
Yeah. So, Mark, what is President Trump willing to accept from Iran to lift some of these sanctions? He has said he wants regime change. How tall of an order is that?
Well, we're kind of all over the place on what the U.S. position is. You know, of course, President Trump several weeks ago made that comment that, you know, quote, "we're with you," in terms of the Iranian protesters, that help was on its way. And that was kind of a notion that perhaps regime change was on the table. But then the U.S. seems to have changed its tune a bit. And there's three buckets here. There's kind of the Iranian nuclear program, there's the ballistic missiles program, and then Iranian support to proxies. And on the nuclear program, the U.S. actually has expressed some desire for actual accommodation, which is surprising, of course, because President Trump had campaigned and has lambasted the old Obama-era JCPOA. That's the old nuclear deal. And so there is a thought now that there could be some sequencing in which the U.S. and Iran could agree on the nuclear issue and then move to some of the tougher issues. But again, it's all up in the air. One quick thing I think is worth noting is the U.S. intelligence community, you know, my old outfit, the CIA, is going to be really important here because they have to assess Iranian plans and intentions and the degree of seriousness in these talks. Don't forget, there is a massive armada that is now kind of poised to strike Iran, and Trump has that in his back pocket. So really, how the Iranians behave, react, and what the U.S. intelligence community can collect on them is going to be really important.
This armada, David, the significant buildup here, does this signal the possibility of military action? Is it for show, or could something actually happen, and how should Iran look at it?
Oh, I think something could definitely happen. I mean, the Israelis, you know, launched strikes last June, and then the U.S. joined in with one set of strikes on the nuclear facilities. So it is kind of gunboat diplomacy threatening the Iranians. And Senator Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat, the senior Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, said that she thinks there is a sincere effort from the administration to negotiate here. But I think there's no question that if the Iranians just won't budge, particularly on the nuclear issues that were talked about, President Trump will use force.
But where would he strike? I mean, I know you're not a naval commander or in the military. Where would he strike to make his point?
So the key question is, I mean, he could strike the nuclear facilities. He could strike.
Which we've done.
We've done.
Which
yes.
we obliterated, apparently, according to him.
Yes. There's ballistic missiles, which are a threat to Israel, but also U.S. forces in the region. The whole issue, though, is does he hope to topple the Iranian regime somehow? And that's a much bigger question. There are Iranians. I was in Geneva, in Munich at the security conference this weekend, and the son of the Shah of Iran, who's sort of leading the opposition efforts and trying to sort of unify all these opposition groups together, called for strikes. He thinks these talks are worthless, and he said people will take to the streets if these strikes begin. But it's very hard for airstrikes to end, a regime, to hit police stations where you have police officers who were just gunning down thousands of Iranians, as we saw when the previous protests happened. So what is the goal here? You never want to go into, military action. And as a country and for the president himself, what are you trying to achieve here? And if that's not clear, that's a dangerous situation.
Very quick assessment on Munich and how the U.S. delegation was received.
Marco Rubio is a very skilled politician, and he was much more about trying to unify with Europeans. But the bottom line was, we don't believe in immigration. We are backers. We're all from a Western civilization. It was very much the same Trump message, but packaged in a more effective,
more palatable,
way.
Perhaps,
There's still
way.
deep fears in Europe that Trump wants to seize Greenland. That's a huge issue there, and then he's going to abandon Ukraine, and so it didn't solve the longer-term problem.
And speaking of Marco Rubio, Mark, he traveled to Budapest to meet with Hungarian President Viktor Orban, who's up for re-election in a few months. Let's listen to what Rubio said about the president's relationship with Orban.
President Trump is deeply committed to your success because your success is our success. Because this relationship we have here in Central Europe through you is so essential and vital for our national interests in the years to come. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. I'm going to be very blunt with you. The Prime Minister and the President have a very, very close personal relationship and working relationship. And I think it has been incredibly beneficial to the relationship between our two countries.
What do you make of that, especially when you see how the Trump administration is treating the EU?
So, so much for that softer tone from Rubio at Munich. I think a lot of European officials, actually, they did wake up this morning and I think realized that, this idea that somehow there would be kind of a different U.S.-European relationship just because Rubio made nice, that is not accurate. And of course, Rubio then goes to Hungary, in which the leader there, Orban, is kind of the plague of Europe. I mean, he's despised there. And so I think that's, first of all, it's obviously U.S. interference in Hungarian affairs and elections coming up in April. And Orban is actually expected to lose. So it's kind of strange that Rubio and Trump actually endorsed him. But again, this is a sign that the U.S.-European dynamic is really in big trouble. I think, I almost saw the European reaction almost, it's part of an abusive relationship when they kind of got, when there was cheering, there was an ovation for Rubio, because fundamentally, as David noted, nothing really has changed in kind of core issues like Greenland and others. And so off to Hungary. He was in Rubio, by the way, was in Slovakia before, another kind of country which has a right-wing government, which really has alienated much of the rest of Europe.